Businesswoman Press, and how I came to be Bequested, this company, there's no other way of putting it, was through a very, very long friendship. I used to traipse around with my bag of books, literally. It's a very different scene now, but I would go along the footpath with a black case on wheels to all the bookshops around Sydney and Canberra. So it really was the halcyon days. So the book metadata would be fed out to Amazon and Booktopia, as well as to Dymocks, as well as to indie publishers, as well as to Barnes & Noble or Waterstones, internationally.
Yeah.
So actually your books are getting exposure whereby, you could literally say my book's available all over the world and it can just print in location.
Curiosity got the better of me. I looked up Ginninderra. I'm reading it here now. It says sparkling or throwing a little ray of light, which is such a beautiful backstory.
Hello, I'm Debbie Lee, and I'm a publisher, a creator and a connector. And I love, most of all, helping people express themselves through writing to tell their stories.
I'm Di Gillett, and this is the Power of Women podcast. We're a platform that showcases and celebrates the strength, resilience and achievement of women from all walks of life. And today, that walk of life is all about the written word. Authors, publishing, writing festivals, all things literary. And as you've heard, today's guest is in that industry. She is a publishing veteran. She's a champion of indie authors. She is the CEO and publisher of Ginninderra Press. And please correct me, Deb, if that is not the correct pronunciation.
It's a soft
we'll get
G.
to that. A soft G. Ginninderra. Okay. Industry connector, festival director, and all things publishing. There's also a really unique aspect of today's story which we'll touch on, because I don't think in any of my years in business I have ever met somebody who was bequeathed a company. So that speaks in volumes to trust and integrity. So without any ado, Debbie Lee, welcome to the Power of Women podcast.
Thank you so much, Di. And yes, it has been an amazing whirlwind of a year or two. I will, with, a heart full of love and sadness, obviously, the idea of telling the story of Ginninderra Press and how I came to be Bequested, this company, there's no other way of putting it, was through a very, very long friendship with Stephen Matthews, my predecessor and the founder of the company. So effectively he started the company 28 years ago in 1996. And prior to that, he was a bookseller. He was a history teacher prior to that. He came from the UK. I met him in my very first job as a sales rep with the publishing company. I used to traipse around with my bag of books, literally. It's a very different scene now, but I would go along the footpath with a black case on wheels to all the bookshops around Sydney and Canberra. And he was the sales manager at the ANU bookshop, the Uni Co-op, at Canberra or at ANU University. And that wasn't just a textbook shop, that was actually a really amazing bookshop of trade books, of fiction, non-fiction, even children's books. And Stephen was the curator, if you like. He was the first bookshop manager in Canberra that I met, and I just had a crash in my brand new company car, turned up on the doorstep, bawling my eyes out, and he took me under his wing.
I think we've all done that with the company car at some point.
Back in the day, I don't even know if they provide company cars these days, so it really was the halcyon days. And it's all those roundabouts in Canberra, which I'll always complain about. But obviously I'm a bit more of an experienced driver now. And he took me under his wing, and that was the sort of beginning of a friendship. He was a few years older than me. And over the years, I moved on into educational publishing from being a sales rep, and he moved on to set up Ginninderra Press. So we actually lost contact for many years. Eventually, I joined a company after having published textbooks, predominantly academic and professional resources in health and education across the humanities and other areas. I decided to try my hand at something a little bit different, and I joined a company that was all about print on demand. It was a new technology in Australia, and I contacted Ginninderra Press thinking that they were in Canberra because I was heading to Canberra. Hadn't put two and two together that it was Stephen Matthews' company. He'd in the interim moved to Adelaide, but I contacted him and he said, no, I'm in Adelaide. And I said, is that Stephen Matthews that I used to know from the ANU co-op? And it was. And once I told him about the print on demand side of things, he'd been publishing really, beautiful smaller books, novella, poetry, memoir, from people who would otherwise not tend to get a contract in mainstream publishing because they didn't have a platform, because they were, retired or, just wrote for, just to express themselves. I mean, good quality product, but he gave them a platform. And he was busy publishing, doing little boxes of 200 books and shuffling them around in his garage. And it was getting to the point where he was looking at retirement because it was too hard. Books don't sell as well as they used to. The bookshop, even the ANU Unicoop and all Unicoops closed. Unicoops closed in the interim, so that gives you an indication of what was happening in the industry. But he was still very dedicated to providing this platform for indie authors or independent authors who wanted a contract. So he did all the work. He did the designing, he did the editing, he did everything in-house. And when I told him about this print-on-demand technology, it completely revolutionised his business because he'd published literally thousands of books. He'd put them out of print when they'd stopped selling after, a number of years, and he kept growing. Those books now never have to go out of print. It's really... So, and also meant he didn't have to print quantities. He could just print one at a time. It also meant, I'm being a sales rep because I was the sales manager of this company for 9 years. But the
Go on, sell
really
it to me, Deb. Sell it.
Can't help myself. But it was also, so you're not wasting money on print runs when you're guessing how many might sell. And it also had the network to the retailers all around the world. So the book metadata would be fed out to Amazon and Booktopia, as well as to Dymocks, as well as to indie publishers, as well as to Barnes & Noble or Waterstones, internationally.
Yeah.
So actually your books are getting exposure whereby, you could literally say my book's available all over the world and it can just print in location, one book at a time. So Stephen said to me, he was planning to retire, but because of me, he sort of cursed me, oh God, I'm still working. But his business went from strength to strength. He became, one of the sort of poster pin-up publishers of this particular platform that I was the sales manager for.
And the curiosity got the better of me. I looked up Ginninderra before we went to air today, and clearly the name comes from the time when he lived in Canberra, because
exactly.
it comes from that part of Indigenous culture and those peoples around that area. And it says it was, looking it up, I'm reading it here now, it says sparkling or throwing a little ray of light, which is such a beautiful backstory. Yeah.
Exactly. It was such a beautiful, concept, and every little book is like a little ray of light. It certainly is from the author's perspective because this is their passion, and the authors are realistic, generally speaking, and if they're not, I have to sort of say, look, we're not going to be able to print 3,000 and get it into all the bookshops. So those authors are people that may end up aspiring to mainstream trade publishing, and I will certainly give them, recommendations in that regard. I'm not trying to sort of cling to everyone. I cannot publish, every book that comes to me. There are too many, but it's about just being true to the author's aspirations and maybe explaining to them that reality is that most books sell well under 1,000 copies. 90% of books sell under 1,000 copies. A certain percentage sell under 10 copies, except it's not all captured because we say to authors, the most books that you're going to sell is to the people you know, the people that you hand sell to, the people at the launches. Yeah.
There's a reason not to give them away.
Correct. Oh, well, you do give away a certain quantity to reviewers. And, you do want to...
I must admit, my bookshelves to my right here are gathering as the publishing community send me a lot of books to consider for interview. Yeah.
I bet. And that's the beauty of things like podcasts. So what we're now doing is sort of, in some ways, training authors to think outside the box, because they're certainly not going to sell most of their books in bookshops, but they will sell via having a homepage, or, you know, if it's with Ginninderra, their homepage can link to the Ginninderra Press website, which we've just updated and relaunched, because, as I say, Stephen was not commercial. He actually didn't even really meet with authors, and his advice to me was, Deb, have as little direct contact other than email, because you'll wear yourself out. So I've learned that sort of the hard way, but it's actually not me. I have to connect.
Yeah, coming from the world of executive search, not meeting or not talking to people wasn't an option, and it's an interesting point actually, because I may challenge or even annoy some people when they refer somebody to me as a potential podcast guest, because, and you've been through my process, I always like to have an initial discussion, whether it's face-to-face or via Zoom, and that initial discussion's, you know, usually the best part of an hour, but it's important for me to get a read on somebody before we sit and have this conversation. It gives it a richness that doesn't exist if you go in cold, and I imagine it's pretty similar for you.
Oh, absolutely, and because I'm a people person, and because I really believe these days. Sorry, I have a cat here that's trying to sort of stretch in front of the camera. I'm keeping him at bay.
That's right. We are on YouTube. It'll look good.
That's right. He's very handsome.
Tail going across the screen.
He's sort of like stretching in his sleep. So, but I totally agree. And, you know, as Stephen's wife said to me, Deb, you have to put your brand on it. You have to do things your way. But he did have a point that it can be exhausting. Look, here he comes. I'll just have to lift him up, and there you go.
Oh, that's a very beautiful cat.
It is like having a baby. You never know when they're going to start crying. But anyway.
Yeah, particularly in that Siamese family.
Correct. He's a rag doll, but he looks very Siamese-like.
He's beautiful.
We have another one, but she's sort of sleeping, so that's good. She doesn't like him. So, yeah, that was something that I've had to kind of gravitate or learn about, just to kind of learn to manage, because when I was a mainstream publisher, I had a list of, 10, 15, maybe 20 books a year that I was publishing. Stephen was pushing out 100 books a year. I can't do that. The way he was doing it was very systematic, and it was less engagement. He had his Quark. He was using a very outmoded design platform.
Wow, so I haven't heard. There'll be listeners who are going, I need to Google that. I don't know what Quark is.
That's right. So I'm very fortunate that I do know a lot.
Yeah, it's in the world of floppy disks for those who can't kind of remember, and matrix dot printers.
Exactly.
And landline telephone. So if you need to go and look that up, that's where you might find it.
We're in another era, and it kept working for him, but when it came to the transition of the business, it just wasn't working, let alone trying to get 100 books out, let alone the fact that he was doing it all in-house, and I've got to pay a producer, a designer to basically convert the Quark to InDesign, to then reformat it. He'd done the editing, but in that process you have to double check everything. So there were cost blowouts as well. So the wonderful gift, there was also a lot to do in the back end, and I've had to explain that to authors and say to them, look, you actually have to subsidise to some extent. That's become quite the norm within the independent publishing world, that we now have a hybrid model of publishing whereby authors help carry the costs, because the production is never going to be covered, or in some instances it will be, but generally speaking it's not going to be covered by the sales because of all the other reasons that I was talking about.
So Stephen sadly passed away through a cancer journey. Yeah. Is that right?
That's correct. He had mouth cancer 13 years ago, and he recovered. And his business kept growing, and he was awarded the Order of Australia, which was a wonderful achievement he was very proud of. So and I'd actually launched his 20th anniversary. He wrote the history of Ginninderra Press, which I launched at Tea Tree Gully Library back, however many years ago, it was about 8 years ago, when I was still working with this print-on-demand platform. So we really re-engaged. Our friendship had sort of, grown through that. And at the time I was really nervous about conducting this, prestigious launch. So now I just get up there and, launch books or do talks. It's sort of like I actually track my progression in terms of confidence through this journey, and probably working at that particular company where I got this bird's eye view. I wasn't just working with Steve, I was working with hundreds of publishers, large and small. So the big internationals, I was working with HarperCollins and Hachette and Penguin Random House, as well as all the academic publishers that have literally hundreds of thousands of titles, Springer and Cambridge and those sorts of companies, and getting their books ingested into the system along with my international colleagues. But where I gravitated was the small publishers in Australia, because I could see this massive grassroots, growth in that market, partly because of print on demand. But, that was where and also because there's so much fun to work with, and there's literary festivals, and there's, lots of events, and the idea of even just writing clubs, writing groups in libraries. I'd go off to anywhere to give a talk about how print on demand can change your life, and also from a publishing background, why it's important to publish as if you were a professional. Don't just write a book and stick it in the system and think it's going to sell. You have to invest in that process, the editing, the design, that you're in charge as the indie author. You can pick and choose who you want to work with. So all of these things have democratised the publishing industry, and that's where I get my sort of, happiness from, my satisfaction from helping people understand that they have options.
So is print on demand the back end of what supports somebody's self-publishing? Is that essentially the mechanism? I mean, it's like every industry, it becomes more efficient, and it sounds like this is the efficiency moment for the publishing sector, where you're not sitting with millions of books waiting to be mulched if they haven't.
Exactly. And the beauty of it is the big publishers use it to regenerate their backlist, so they never lose a sale. So books that were traditionally put out of print are now being sort of ingested into the system en masse. But for an indie author, they can just create one book if they want. And, there's all sorts of, as I say, there's freelance production experts that can help them make sure the book is as good a quality. And honestly, when it's printed, it doesn't look any different to a mainstream printed book. The only difference is there's no bells and whistles. You can't put spot lamination and embossing and, those sorts of things.
It's a paperback. It's not a hardback.
You can do a hardback.
Okay.
And you can even do a hardback with a dust cover. I mean, I should get commission for what I do spruiking this company.
Yeah.
But also ebooks. It actually distributes ebooks as well. And that's just a different file that's uploaded.
Yeah, right.
Everything's equal in this game, but it means that anyone can be a publisher, but I don't say that lightly, because I don't think it's as simple as just, as I say, putting a Word document into the system.
No, I can imagine. So let's go back to Ginninderra for a moment. Did you know that business was coming your way with Stephen's illness progressing, or were you blindsided by that?
I was a bit blindsided. I mean, as I say, we've resumed the friendship. I'd stayed overnight with Stephen and his wife Brenda, just intermittently, because I'd gone to Adelaide for a book conference, and I'd said, I'm here for a night, and they'd say, stay, those sorts of things. But it did come as a shock, because it came at the same time as he was diagnosed with the recurrence of the mouth cancer, and it had become terminal. So there was a real sadness and a real desire to, help to make sure that his legacy lives on, which is also a huge responsibility. And, of course, I was ill for a bit. My mother was dying at the same, and also I'd left that big company to go to Sydney on a regular basis because my mum was dying. So I'd left the company, and he knew that I'd left. I'd taken on a festival director role with a sort of literary festival, which is a part-time job. So I did have time, but...
Yeah, they're the ones that take all the time.
They actually do. So I'm wearing various hats.
Yeah.
And I had been setting up my little indie publishing consulting business, the Book Maven, which I hadn't got the homepage up. I was too busy. But that's when this offer came. And I thought, wow, it is everything I've ever sort of worked towards, and I wanted to do it. But as I say, a lot is changing in the process. So it's not the same Ginninderra Press. I'm seeing through the authors that I have inherited, but I'm taking it in new directions. So when I do see something that is commercial, I do, try and grab it. But I've got to establish a whole lot of new ways of doing things. And one of the reasons that print on demand is so good is that distribution into bookshops is really difficult. And print on demand just sort of gives you that leverage, but the bookshops will only buy a book if someone comes in and orders it. They won't just take books speculatively. And so I don't want to, oversell into bookshops, because those books will come back and I don't have a warehouse. So these are the things that I'm grappling with. If I take on a big time author, how much can I afford to sort of risk in that equation?
So is it a privilege or a burden to be bequested a business?
Yeah, it's a mixture. It's a mixture because I feel deeply a responsibility, and I can't work as quickly as Stephen because the systems have had to change so dramatically. And, but the beautiful thing is that the authors are so understanding and they don't have, delusions of grandeur. Not all of them, but a lot of them, the majority.
Yeah, I mean, human nature would suggest it couldn't be all of them. There'd have to be some stories that you share 100%. Over a drink in your publishing community.
Those who shall not be named.
Yeah. I'd love you to, but I appreciate you're not going to. So yeah, okay.
But yeah, look, you have to deal with quirks, and you have to also explain things. And sometimes there's a book that I might say, gee whiz, I know Stephen accepted it, but it isn't quite what I want to publish. So these are things I have to consider, because he actually didn't contract authors until they were at the later stage, which is highly unusual. You usually have some sort of agreement in place, a written, signed agreement at the outset.
Yeah, I don't know who carries greater risk there. It could go either way, couldn't it?
That's right. And I actually think that his method was quite wise, and it was through, probably through a few adverse scenarios where they decided to part their ways. So he actually would give a contract just when he was about to sort of, upload the book almost. So those authors are with me through, they've been gifted to me. I haven't contracted all of them yet.
How often does an author pitch and then not finish a book? What's that ratio look like?
Generally speaking, well, with Ginninderra, they were pretty much finished. The manuscripts were submitted and considered by Stephen. And what he would do was print everything out and, sort of like send them. He'd do the design, print it out hard copy, take a little walk down the road to the post office, send them the hard copy. They'd mark it up by hand, and then he'd take in the changes, which is so old school. This is on top of the quark, design. So no one does that. It sort of took me back 30 years.
There's something lovely about it too. At the same time, I mean, it's romantic, but it's not commercial and it's not scalable. So
no, that's right. Yeah. And I have trouble with the handwriting. Some of it, and a lot of the books were poetry books. They're small. They're not that demanding in terms of the editing process, but still, you've got to, and you do
so
that
in
twice.
Inheriting a business, did you inherit hundreds and hundreds of boxes of stuff?
Yes, filing cabinets full.
Yeah, right.
So, like I say, it is it's a process.
Yeah, there's the blessing and curse aspect of it. Yeah.
It is. It's quite a process, but I am loving it, and I now have a partner helping me, and she's really, she's the yin to my yang. She's very focused on strategic, setting up the infrastructure, but also the marketing. And so she can sort of pull together what we call a new book information sheet, which we give to the authors to disseminate, but we also adapt for the library market and the retail market. And, she'll do a press release for media. Some of our authors who are more sophisticated or actually want to invest are actually appointing publicists. So we are getting more
I'm
access.
seeing a lot of that. I'm on the receiving end of that multiple times a week, so I can see that that's becoming quite the trend. One other thing I was going to ask is there something you wish people would be writing more or less about in terms of subject matter?
I think, poetry is a very niche market, so it feels to me like everybody's, writing poetry because that's what has been coming into my, little catchment. And memoir and novella. But I think what's happening is that people are writing and people are wanting to write about their memoir, and I think that's lovely, but it's still very personal, and I feel like you've got to kind of really focus and understand if you're writing a memoir.
Sometimes that's just a personal journey, not
everybody wants to know about your
published.
grandmother, So, but I'm just happy for people to write, and for on the other side of the coin that people are still reading, because it has waned over the years. Books are smaller, chapters are more like vignettes, which is fine. It actually means that people are writing in a more sort of crystallised way. They're synthesising.
So that's following the same way as our viewing habits of where people are, headline grabs and absorption of news is now down to a sound bite and a headline, and it's only our generation, Deb, that are still watching nightly news, which is why people like my husband become redundant, because the news reader is going to be like the bank teller, that they're disappearing.
Exactly. And there's this pressure to keep it short, and also the news. I mean, that's one other thing that's happening, and I think books have an imperative to document the whole story, not from a biased perspective, because now we're seeing particular news platforms that are very left or very right, owned by a particular media magnate, and that sort of is impacting.
Don't know what you're talking about.
No, I'm sure not.
No idea.
But it's kind of, like we're actually educating people in biased funnels, which worries me. And I think it used to be, when your husband was really at the helm, when SBS, for example, became a new channel, it was world opening. It opened our minds and eyes and ears up to a whole new way of thinking. And I feel like everything's sort of becoming reductive now in a way.
Well, I think, and it sounds like books have gone down the same thing. It's once upon a time we used to tell the story, not your story.
Yeah, exactly.
Or your point of view, but it sounds like books are following that same channel.
And you wonder if it's the chicken and the egg. Is it because that's what the audience that they're, we tell people to write for their audience, and yet the audience has become so sort of, finite, that if you do that, you're not going to broaden the minds. But if you do write with a broader perspective, are you going to lose your core audience? How do you sort of like bring them along for the ride and actually expand their minds in the process? And I think that's what a good writer should be aiming to do.
Yeah. Well, actually, on that note, let's take a break. And coming up, I want to find out more about how we take that thought bubble of an idea to print.
Wonderful.
If you're loving the Power of Women podcast, be sure to jump onto our YouTube channel and hit that subscribe button to ensure you never miss an episode. So, Deb, just before we went to a break, we were talking about the process of publishing. How difficult is it actually for someone to pursue becoming an author?
Wow, I think you have to really, really want to do it, and you have to understand that you don't just sort of write whatever comes to mind and, submit it for review or potential publishing. That's going to be painfully obvious to any publisher. But the whole process now is that authors do their research, even if it's a novel. They have to read. They have to read other books in the same genre. They have to understand the sort of themes and the characterization and the plots and they really need to know why their book is different what sort of elements they want to emulate. They have to map it out, and then they have to actually invest in the editing process even before they submit it. It used to be that, you know, a great book would be polished at the publishing house's sort of interface.
But not today.
No. You actually have to get that book as good as it can possibly be. And that's not to say that the publisher might not actually say, look, I really like it, but we want you to elevate this character, or we want you to sort of, you know, colour, you know, like if it's 80,000 words, bring it down to 60,000 words, bearing in mind that people are reading shorter books.
Does it ever fall over at that point? I mean, I know as a character, revisiting something is probably one of the things I find most difficult, because trying to bring that same energy to a redo.
Yep. And sometimes it can lose
its energy.
Yeah, sometimes it can. And I've known, you know, a few authors that have gone back, taken on board, because the other danger is that you take on board too many people's, you know, opinions. The more people you ask, the more varied opinions you're going to get. And it comes down to choose carefully who you want to engage with, and you're not beholden to those words of advice. You have to weigh it up, decide what you want to take on, and decide what you want to sort of let go. And so that's really very much in the author's ballpark. But if they actually want to do this, they'll be willing to roll up their sleeves. Excuse the cat.
We have a cat revisiting.
Here we go, putting him down. So it's really about being thick-skinned, asking the right questions of the right people, but being also aware that you don't have to take on board every piece of advice. But I do think it's a really important process, definitely engaging a qualified editor, and that's not your mother or your daughter or your, you know, uncle who's, you know, got an interest in World War One to read your romance novel. Like, you've really got to find the right people and be willing to pay. And the editing is the biggest cost. But that's what, and also in terms of submitting to a publisher, you need to have your pitch. You need to have your paragraph, which could form the basis of a back cover blurb, for example, 150 to 200 words that really sum up the why, the what, and the who. Who's it
so
for?
If I've got an idea for a book, am I coming to you to pitch simply the idea, or am I coming to you when I've got part of the book down on paper or
Yeah. Look, all publishers are different, and a lot of publishers have a submission portal, but they'll say we are not accepting book, you know, proposals at this time. But they'll also say we want your first 3 chapters, we want the synopsis, and we want the bio about you and why you're the right author for this particular book. So they'll tell you what they want, and they might only have, you know, 1 month in a year that they're actually accepting submissions, because and they're working with a 12, 18 month or 2 year sort of schedule. So big publishers, even when you're accepted. Yep. So there's not that agility, because they actually are planning a huge, a marketing campaign. They've got the reps. They even sell, this cat is being problematic. They sell in, 3-4 months in advance.
Don't let him step on the off button.
No, that's right. That's why I've got to catch him. He could be asleep all day, but today he chooses to be a pain.
He chooses to be part of the show.
That's it. He's a show pony. So I think that, with the sell-in, and big publishers, they have a lead time, and they're also gauging in that lead time, whether bookshops think the cover's going to sell, and they might make tweaks in that process. And that's
so are all books going to bookshelves, or some books going direct to audio or digital?
Some books are just ebook only.
Yeah.
If they're going to audio, it's probably mainstream publishers, but if it's an indie author, they can now do that, but it's extremely expensive, and that's a whole.
Even if you narrate it yourself.
You can narrate it yourself, but you have to do it in a proper studio. So you've still got to have the sound engineers and the technical side of things down pat. And generally speaking, if you're using an indie radio or audio producer, they will say to you, you're best off appointing a narrator, and they'll give you a whole lot of might be 5-10 recordings of various narrators who are actors or they're trained specialists, just reading a snippet, and you can choose who you want. And that's if you want your audiobook to sing, you would go.
That's what you do.
Yeah, but audiobooks are definitely growing in terms of marketability and how a lot more people are listening to audiobooks.
It's a time thing, isn't it? You can take it on the run with you versus
exactly
how many of us got time to sit with a book in our hand these days. So I can understand
do
that.
you actually say that you've read a book when you've listened to it? This is something that I grapple with.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing, isn't it? I think I say I've listened to a book, not read a book. I'm not sure. There's a Trivial Pursuit question for you.
Exactly. But I think if people are imbibing books by whatever means, it's a wonderful thing, and we just want it to keep keeping on. Yeah. Because people aren't buying books in the same way that they used to.
That's right. And are female authors on the rise? It feels to me like they are.
It feels to me like they are, just going on the basis of the number of manuscripts I have and the books that I'm putting out. I think it's partly because you get to a certain point in your life where women are going to become the carers of their parents and so they've got more time and they've got that sort of sentimentality, that ability to
Or is it that women are finding their voice?
Maybe it's both. Absolutely, it's both. And the other side of writing and publishing, there's a lot of people that have put their life's work into book form, and it's not necessarily to take over the world in terms of bookshop land, but it's a means to elevate their personal brand. And it's almost like a calling card now in terms of professional development, self-help, business-oriented books. And that's women and men. So, there are whole organisations that are, sprung up that are online where authors get together and help each other through that process, through peer review, through guest speakers. And that means that the writing process is less solitary, which is a really wonderful thing.
Yes, and I've found that in talking to a number of authors, they're either running workshops for other authors, and that seems to be a growing thing. But you've talked about what publishers look for in authors. What are some of the common mistakes authors make when submitting their work?
In the old days, the work spoke for itself. And, someone like Tim Winton, for example, he's, famously reclusive. And he's obviously an incredibly gifted writer. And he, gets up and makes speeches now. But in the early days, that was not what he necessarily wanted to do. These days, all authors have to understand that they've got to be able to promote themselves and, do as much as they possibly can as the author, not just expect the book to sort of do the talking. And I think that's something that doesn't necessarily come naturally to writers. Not all writers want to be the centre of attention. They want their book to be.
But do all writers want to see their book become the story that makes the big screen?
No, I think that writers are now more realistic, and if they do any research at all, they'll see that that's going to be 1 in a million, and there will be those sort of marketing platforms that sort of say submit here and we'll put... In fact, Wattpad was an online platform that actually did elevate an author's potential of having film rights sold. And there's nothing wrong with that. But still, it's really, really rare if you think about how many films come out and
of course.
Big name authors that actually, have that incredible, thing happen to them. It's really, really unlikely. But you never say never, Things happen.
There are a few famous ones that come to mind, but
But look at Harry Potter. 18 publishers rejected A.K. Rowling before she got the breakthrough, and it was with Bloomsbury, which is not known as a kind of, young adult fiction novel type publisher at the time. So it's one of these things you just have to keep pushing. And I think, we can come up with any of those examples, like, 50 Shades of Grey was another one that was self-published online, and then it became this
was
phenomenon.
it? I didn't know that.
Yeah, so there are things like that. There's Colleen Hoover, whose romance books have taken off. She sold more books than so many, like Stephen King or John Grisham, or she's sold.
I think I was a voracious reader of Patricia Cornwell in the day, because I love a crime story, and I love learning about Quantico. I don't know why. It's just one of those things that's always pressed a button for me in reading.
Exactly. But yeah, so, and then you sort of have these breakthrough moments where someone that's been, pushing the hard yards for years on end just takes off. But it's not just. It's almost like it's gradual, and you don't see it happening, and then all of a sudden they're a breakthrough. But they've been doing this for years, building the foundations.
And then it's historic, like a Tolkien and Lord of the Rings.
Exactly.
So, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's it's an exciting industry, and as much as we talk about the gloom and doom, and bookshop sales have dropped, or bookshops themselves have closed, or big publishers are swallowing up the mid-sized publishers.
But it hasn't disappeared. It's shifted.
It's shifted. That's right.
Yeah. Yeah.
And overall, there's probably subliminal growth. There's definitely more opportunity. So I love that. I love that equalisation, and I love the celebratory element, the literary festivals now that are bringing people together in regional areas that are
Yes, I can see that's becoming a burgeoning thing, and in some respects that's replacing the bookstore as the gathering and the meeting place, albeit I'm fortunate enough to have a very beautiful bookstore within a 5-kilometre radius of home in Melbourne. That's probably a stalwart of all bookstores, but they're few and far between these days.
Absolutely, and I guarantee that the bookstores that do really thrive might actually be the ones that also attend and sell at those literary festivals. So they hold book launches, or they have children's storytime reading. So they're thinking outside the box. They're not just kind of like waiting for people to come in. They're actually engaging with the community. They're
creating events. Yeah,
that's really important. And libraries, let's not forget the incredibly important place of libraries. And COVID really saw a boom in library
of course it did.
Membership. So, we're very grateful that exists. And when you think about what's happening in America with, literally the burning of books and the censorship of classics, and you think this is such a,
cancel
volatile
culture's
time.
Hitting the book industry. Yeah.
Yeah. Really, really, it's quite frightening, because you sort of think,
well, the ones you and I grew up with have been cancelled. I mean, we could go through the list of Enid Blyton and go on, because
Judy Blume. I mean, can you imagine Puberty Blues? That would, if that was in America, that would just.
So, how many writers have been cancelled? If we think about that, is the list long?
I think it is. In America, they've actually gone through, and I mean, they're trying to close down the Department of Education, let alone, books and libraries and access to, even educational materials, science. There's lots of pushback on evolution versus creationism. Like, there's lots and lots of things going on in the enlightened world that is pulling us into a dark era. And I do feel like publishers are fighting tooth and nail to retain their independence and to continue pushing for books that speak to the LGBTQ community, or books that are YA fiction that might involve, dare I say it, sex or something, like real world stuff that certain communities or political orientations are trying to stifle and silence. So I think there is probably quite a lot of authors that are feeling the pinch, but we just have to keep pushing through. And I think Australia's at least where, hopefully never going to enter into that dark world, but it does have ramifications.
And I understand the oldest living library is in Verona, in Italy. So
wow.
I have some insights into what might be happening there, but that's incredible, and I know within their walls they've got manuscripts that predate centuries, which is just just extraordinary. So the written word is a rich storytelling and capture of history.
Absolutely. In fact, I'm reading a book at the moment about the Gatlinburg Bible. I'm trying to think of the right word. I'm getting it confused. But it's basically the Bible that, was the first Bible that was printed, and it became an antiquarian book. So there was only a certain number, and then someone who the book is about pulled the leaves out, the separate sections of the book, because he had a copy and it wasn't complete, and he sold them off, which was sacrosanct. It was a total travesty, but made millions, and now collectors all over the world can say, I've got a leaf from Genesis, or I've got a leaf from this.
Heavens.
Yeah, it's a really interesting story, and you think about the history of the book and how important it is, and these books were manuscripts that were calligraphic. But yeah, really, there's a lot of there's a history of the book that we have to cherish and keep going for as long as we can. And I think, back when they started with ebooks, they were like, that's going to overtake, and print books are no longer going to be available. That was the kind of message that a lot of publishers were scared of, and it hasn't happened. It's just expanded to enable more formats so readers can pick and choose.
Yeah, I think my only reading regret in that, and I listen to ebooks because it's a time thing, and I can take them with me in my ear while I'm doing other things. But magazines, I don't purchase them like I used to, which is we can see that in the demise of the magazine trade. But yeah. I don't like reading a magazine online either. The turning of a page of a magazine is something I don't have enough time to do, but something I used to love doing a lot of.
And the long-form articles that you would find in Vanity Fair or in, some of the classic magazines.
I grew up with Dominic Dunn as my favourite crime writer in Vanity Fair. He was one of my favourite authors of the time.
Exactly. And if you don't have the hard copy delivered to your home, you just don't have that sort of engagement, because we're reading on the run when we're reading online. So you might get through one article, but you're not flicking to the next page necessarily. So it's definitely had a dramatic impact. And it worries me about, the calibre of, like we touched on, the calibre of journalism, because they have to keep it short and
short and sharp.
Yeah,
punchline.
Yeah. So I guess I'm on a mission to, keep people talking about books, engaging with books, whatever format that takes, writing books, and not thinking that they haven't got something important to say. But if you do have something important to say, package it in a way that's as accessible and meaningful and informational as possible, so that people don't have to read a whole lot of guff to get to the kernel of your idea. Really, and I think it's so important, and also creating platforms for the exposition of that information, not just expecting people to come to it by some sort of fluke, but talking it up, and whether it's a podcast or a radio interview or a book review or, speaking opportunity at a festival. These are the things that you have to do. And I think people are becoming more articulate. Obviously writing's one thing, but speaking about your skill base or your interest, or whether it's fiction or non-fiction or children's books, speaking it up is becoming a really critical part of it. And I think women are, as you're giving a platform to people to express themselves, we are wanting that engagement. We are looking for those opportunities, because we've had so many years of not having the same equal access, the same opportunities, and I feel now we're in our prime. We're owning that space, which is part of the important, the publishing process. That's a really important part.
Absolutely.
I sound like an evangelical, don't I?
Yeah, well, I mean, you're putting your case forward, and I was going to ask you, advice for an aspiring author, but you've just laid it bare, and I think being more well-rounded and prepared to sell your story on all of the mediums to bring your book to life is probably one of those key messages that you've just pointed out. It's not just about taking the idea to the publisher. You need to have the vision of all of the points of promotion and be prepared to play a role in that.
Absolutely. And you need time, and you need to allow time, even when the book's finished, to promote it before it actually comes out. There's that building up of, it could be 3 or 4 months. And you can still go in and talk to your local bookshop, and they might take a few copies on consignment, if you're not with a mainstream publisher, that is. And that's part of that process. It's coming soon. Make an appointment. Don't just rock on up and shove a book in front of a bookshop and say, I've already published it, put it on your shelf. I did it on Amazon. They will not put it on the shelf. So these are tricks of the trade that, authors, some learn the hard way, but again, more authors are availing themselves of the resources that are out there to learn, to study, to educate themselves. And there's organisations like the Australian Society of Authors that you can join and really get, well-rounded, top-quality information to...
Well, I've got a half-written book that I started in the 90s, Deb. Maybe it's time to bring it back. Yeah,
dust it off.
Yeah.
This
Do you
is
know how old it is? It is on floppy disk.
Have you got the equipment to sort of unearth that?
I actually bought something not that long ago to convert it. So maybe.
Is it fictional, or is it a...
It's a self-deprecating story, and the title was Bald as a Badger, which was a personal journey in the late 90s when I developed alopecia totalis and lost all my hair. Wow. And it's a self-deprecating story of dealing with that, with a view to help others through humour. So
that's fantastic. I can see that would have a huge market, and it's all about... Oh my God,
I've just pitched my book.
You haven't. I'll sign it up. No obligation, because you will have big name publishers knocking at your door now.
There you go. The pitch is out there. I've pitched it live on Power of Women today. So yeah, we'll talk about that offline, Deb. One last question I've got today. As a businesswoman, and previously sort of as an employee, now as a business owner, albeit you'd had your own businesses before. Yeah. But what's a lesson you wish you had learnt sooner through the lens of a businesswoman?
Gee, I really feel like being a business owner is so different to being a publisher, let alone working in a publishing house where you have a whole, range of colleagues that are helping the process. As a publisher, I had editors, I had designers, I had sales reps, I had marketing, I had other people sharing the decision making with me, even though the onus was on me to, push that book through and to mould it and to work with the author. Now I'm actually doing it all, and you can only do so much. I realise, and there's also, things like BAS and royalties and, the infrastructure, building the website. These are things that, I don't consider my strengths. I'm learning fast, but it's been a baptism by fire. So I guess it's not that I didn't know, but I hadn't done it. And so, get your skates on every day, sort of like, what's going to hit me now? What didn't I anticipate? So there is something to be said for being an employee. But
you've touched on something wonderful, and I have this conversation with many midlife women on Power of Women, is we're never too old to learn, and we have had to upskill ourselves in so many areas of business and commerce and sales and marketing and technical capability that we didn't have before, and I think that's a huge message for somebody thinking about starting a business. Being a jack of all trades, it takes a lot, but I think think we've become very adept at learning new things and adopting change. And I have to say, I've become a bit of a connoisseur of change. I enjoy it. I mean, I know only this week our local gym has completely relaid the gym, and I love it. And my husband hates it. So I think women are more open to change.
I think you're right. And I think he'll come round. You know, it's the initial response that can sometimes be that knee-jerk, it's not what I'm used to. And I have that. I have a fear of, new things. But, a couple of days in, I'm like, almost forget that I had that initial, reaction.
Well, I get bored, so I like newness. I like change. I like a new spin on something.
Yeah,
so
that's why I love new books, new titles, new authors. I'm always sort of like, as much as I love the books I've already produced, it's the next big thing that I'm looking for, So, and that's the diversity. Your job is never the same from one day to the next, and that's, I guess, something that I really thrive on. That diversity, and the ability to kind of help something come into the world. It is like giving birth for a lot of authors. So, to be part of that, it's like being a midwife or a doula, a book doula.
So are you open to pitches as we bring today's discussion to a close? If there's a listener out there with a book just burning in the background, are you taking approaches or not?
We're almost at capacity, so it will be a little bit of a waiting time, but I never say no because you just don't know. And so, we've got this little backlist of books that we're pushing through. We've got a lot of books in the system, but I don't say no because I want people to feel that, they can at least submit their proposal online through our website. We've got a submissions portal, and it might take 8 to 12 weeks for us to get to the review process, but at least then people know that they've done that. That doesn't stop them submitting elsewhere. But, sometimes just having this conversation and now going, okay, I thought I had a book, but now I really think I'm going to go and get an editor to look at it first before I submit it. I think that's the lesson. And also, you've got to put in a proposal, a synopsis, a bio of yourself, and, think a bit about why you're writing this book, not just throw the manuscript in the air and hope that, someone catches it.
Well, thanks for that. I'm going to go off and find that floppy disk and put it through the floppy disk converter and see what I wrote all that time ago. So,
fantastic.
Brilliant.
I think you should, and there's probably a few other people out there that'll do the same.
Yeah, exactly. Deb, thank you for your time today. It's always insightful hearing how different industries work and how businesses operate. And I know if somebody is thinking about putting pen to paper in the romantic sense, not in the figurative sense, today's discussion should give them some tips as to how to approach it. So many thanks for joining us, and all the best for Ginninderra Press. Until next time.
Thanks so much, Di.